All right, the floor is yours, Dr. LaPier. Thank you so much. We're looking forward to this evening.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. So we are live from the Payne Family Native American Center here at the University of Montana. We are in the rotunda. Please let me know if you cannot hear me. We are using a microphone that's on my laptop, and we're also using a camera. So I'm going to try and talk loud, but we are in the rotunda behind me, so it can be a little bit echoey. Tonight is, as Faith said, sort of the final workshop that we're going to be doing with all nations, with Here Montana and the Ethnobotany Garden here at the University of Montana. And tonight, what we wanted to share was how to make different types of medicines at home that you can use throughout the winter months. And the versions of methods, the methods that I'm going to be sharing tonight are ones that I learned from my grandmother, and that are really the traditional ways that the Blackfeet have always made medicine. There are, of course, other ways of making medicine and more modern ways as well, and which can be learned. But tonight is going to be specifically kind of the ways that the Blackfeet have made medicine. So, first of all, whenever you do this kind of thing, depending on the family that you come from or the community that you come from, people often will have an offering or a prayer. People will often take tobacco and take it outside and leave an offering. Or oftentimes, like in my family, we usually pray at sunrise and sunset, which is kind of the traditional Blackfeet way of praying. And so if you pray at sunrise and sunset, then you don't often do an additional offering for this sort of thing, but some families do, or some communities do. So always be prepared and have some sort of tobacco with you. And I usually just carry tobacco with me all the time, just in case I need to sort of leave an offering or to give a gift to an elder. So that's always one way to begin when you start this sort of process of making medicine. The next thing to think about and consider whenever you're doing this sort of activity is cleanliness. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cleanliness first. So you should always start by washing your hands thoroughly with soap. Also washing all of the materials that you're going to be using so that they're clean. And the other thing is to make sure they're dry, especially when we start using things, which we'll do towards the end of this workshop. When you use oil, you want to make sure that there is no moisture inside of the jars that you're using. So just make sure everything is clean and dry, and including when you're going to be using things like scissors as well. So we'll be using scissors tonight. I usually clean my scissors in a couple of different ways. Soap and water is one way. You can also use vinegar or alcohol wipes. So one of the ways that you can do this is, if you have extra alcohol wipes at home, is just take the wipe out and wipe down all of your utensils, and then sharpen them before you use them. So I'm going to share, so a few people who signed up ahead of time were able to get some supplies from the All Nations. And so I'm just going to share what some of those supplies are to give you an idea of what you sort of need, the basics for doing this kind of creation of medicine. So in your bag should have been a couple of jars. So mason jars, such as these, are always useful for medicine, and you can find them in lots of different sizes. Usually the place that I go to, my go-to place is always a thrift store. Start at a thrift store or a rummage sale. There's always extra mason jars out there. But then if you want to get lids, you definitely have to go to the store and buy brand new lids. And you can get those just about anywhere. You can get them at a hardware store, the big box store, lots of places. So start with kind of a variety. We have sort of a variety of sizes of mason jars, including the large jars that we have here that have the dried medicines that we're going to be using. The next thing that you should probably have on hand is some sort of sieve. And we have different sizes here. I usually like to use this size, which is a size that fits inside of a jar. So if you're going to be straining something, you want to be able to have a sieve that fits inside of a jar. But you can also have a larger size sieve such as this. And if you have a sieve that's this large, one of the great items to also have for this kind of thing is coffee filters. So coffee filters can be used for lots of different stuff, but also with making medicine or making teas. And when you have a sieve this size, you can always put your coffee filter right inside. And then when you're pouring out the medicine, that already creates an easy way to clean out your sieve without having to use washing it thoroughly. Sometimes we also use glass measuring cups if you want to be really precise about how much ingredients that you're using. I'll just say this though, in most like native or indigenous medicine making, people didn't measure stuff. They would always do it by eye, or they would measure it in the inside of their hand, and they would just sort of look at how much they were adding. Today, most people like to use measuring spoons and measuring cups so that they can be more precise. So it's really up to you. You decide what makes you feel more comfortable, whether it's just measuring it out in your hand or using measuring type utensils, and it doesn't really matter. One of the things I would add about using different types of utensils and cups or mason jars is, I would say, always use glass or something that is a natural substance. I would say avoid plastic at all costs. So avoid plastic for keeping your medicine in, avoid plastic jars or plastic containers. You really always want to be using glass. Oftentimes too, when you're using, when you are stirring things, it's also useful, again, to not use plastic like utensils, but to use wooden ones instead. So wooden spoons, or for example, one of the things that like my grandmother would always use was like willow sticks or chokecherry sticks as one of her for stirring sticks. The modern method of that is if you have chopsticks that are left over from your Chinese food, keep all the wooden chopsticks, just put them in a drawer and use them for this kind of stuff. So when you're stirring stuff up, especially when you're using oils, it's great to just have wooden sticks to be doing that with. So again, sort of avoid plastic, avoid any kind of kind of non-natural material when you're making medicine. The same is true when you are cooking stuff. So tonight we are going to cook some herbs as well. And it's always helpful, I'll pull this over here, to use some sort of like stainless steel pots instead of aluminum. Try to avoid any kind of aluminum or the pots and pans that have the Teflon coating or things like that. So when you're boiling water, you really want to do it sort of in glass or stainless steel. This is just a basic kind of stainless steel pot. I also use a kettle. So this is just a boiling kettle for boiling water. And this, you can see this is made out of glass and stainless steel. So tonight we're going to be doing, making some medicine that is made primarily with water, but also with oil. So the oil that I'm going to share with you, and again, some of you got a kit from All Nations, and it included oil, but historically, Indigenous people did not use vegetable oils. They always used animal fat or animal oil. And oftentimes they would take animal fat, they'd boil it until it became oil, and then they would use that. But since the introduction of olive oil, which came with the Catholic Church to what is now Montana, a lot of indigenous people stopped using animal fats and they started using olive oil. So my grandmother lived on olive oil, and she used to buy the big giant, box store size of olive oil because she made a lot of medicine that had oil in it. So for those of you who got a kit from All Nations, you're going to have kind of a bottle of olive oil that we'll use in just a little bit. So tonight we're going to use, one more thing that I meant to mention. So the other thing that is in your kit, if you got one, is some sort of piece of cloth. So with this kind of cloth that we're going to be using, again, you want to use some sort of natural material. So again, 100% cotton. Try to avoid things like nylon or polyester when you're making medicine. So we're going to be using this tonight, but you can also use a handkerchief. Like if you get 100% cotton handkerchief, you can also use that. And one of the other things you need for this type of stuff is it's helpful to have a hammer, a small one, or a small sledgehammer. Or if you don't have that, sometimes just using a mason jar, a small mason jar to use that you're going to crush stuff with, and you're just going to use the back of it like that. I don't know if we're going to be able to do this on this table because it's made out of plastic. So we have a couple of students with us tonight who are behind the camera. They may have to go out and smash our medicine out on on the concrete over here because I don't think we can do it on this plastic table. So as was mentioned in our in the information that was shared from All Nations, we're going to do different types of medicine tonight, from cold infusion to hot, to boiling water, and then to oil. So cold infusion is just the way it sounds. I think most of us have heard of like cold brew coffee, right? So cold brew coffee is where they basically take coffee, they pour usually room temperature water over the coffee beans. They let it sit all night long, and then they drink it the next day. One of the things that is different about cold brew coffee, because it's made with lukewarm water versus hot water, is it is usually less acidic. So a lot of people like to have cold brew coffee because it's better for your stomach. Some medicines have that same type of kind of reaction between the temperatures of water. So depending on the medicines that you are using, it is going to taste different if you are using cold water versus hot water, and it's also going to have a different amount of kind of medicinal quality. And you can use, in fact, one of the things that we're going to share tonight, you can use certain herbs as any of these things, as either cold infusion or hot infusion or oil infusion. And it just has a different kind of medicinal quality with each kind of method. So the first kind of, okay, I'm going to stop here for a second and ask if there are any questions at this point before I move on. And I'll jump on the chat in case there are any questions. Okay, so I don't see any questions right now, so I'm going to move on. So one of the first, let me see which jar we're going to use here. I might just do it in here. I think I'm just going to use not a mason jar right now, but just sort of our measuring cup. So for the cold infusion. So there's lots of different medicines. that you can use for cold infusion. And tonight, I think I'm just going to start with, excuse me, you can't see what these are. That's not. Okay. So one of the plants that we're going to use in all different methods is going to be white sage. And so most of the herbs or plants that we're using tonight can be used fresh or dried, but for the most part, historically and today, most native people dry their plants for future use. I usually dry mine and keep them in jars. Again, when you're preserving plants for future use, you should always have them in some sort of natural storage. So avoid using plastic bags. I never use Ziploc bags. Avoid plastic bags or plastic containers. My grandmother often used jars, or she used pillowcases. So think about kind of the old-fashioned 100% cotton pillowcase. A lot of her medicines, because she had large quantities of medicine, were kept in pillowcases, and then they were just hung in her storage shed, which was always cold throughout the year. So in this case, we're going to just take a little bit of our sage. And again, this is one of those things where depending on how much you are making, and this was really just sort of the size of a teacup here. There's a couple of different ways that you can do this. One, you can just crunch it up with your hands, but a lot of times it's just easier to use scissors and just cut up your medicine with scissors. And as you can see, I'm not measuring this, I'm just kind of eyeballing it. I always get questions about how much you should be adding to certain types of, how much medicine versus how many cups of water. And I'm just sort of eyeballing this right now. And it already looks like it's about maybe a tablespoon of sage in here. And the only thing that is different depending on how much medicine you add is how strong it's going to be. So as one of the students and I were visiting with earlier, if you don't add too much into any of these infusions and you're adding water to it and you're letting it sit, sometimes it's just like tea. So remember when you buy tea from the store and there's a tea bag and they just give you a little tiny amount, and a lot of times it's maybe about a half teaspoon of whatever that is, whether you have mint tea or even black tea. Oftentimes when you're making medicine, you're using a lot more than that. So in this case, there's probably about maybe, I don't know, a tablespoon and a half of this that has been chopped up. So for kind of cold infusion, when you are making cold infusion, and just kind of imagine that you're going to be having it in a larger jar, but we're not doing it in a larger jar because we're saving this for later, that you would be taking your dried medicines, putting it in there, and then all you're really doing is pouring water that is either, it can be cold, but oftentimes it's just, sorry, I don't have a stirring stick with me. Where'd my pencil go? I'll use my pencil. So don't use a pencil, but I'm going to be using a pencil. So, okay, we're gonna go get a spoon. So normally you just sort of stir it in and you just let it sit. So oftentimes, one of the ways that my grandmother would make these is she would just put it in water, put it in a mason jar, close it up, and let it sit for the day or for overnight. Or she would put it in the refrigerator. So just as a reminder, way back in the day, she did not have electricity, so they did not have a refrigerator. So when she was making medicine, she was often doing this and then just putting it in the cupboard. So oftentimes this sort of thing would just be put in the cupboard, but it would have a lid. One of the things you can also do, if you have, for example, mason jars, again, if you go to the thrift store, if you go to the rummage sale, you're oftentimes buying a mason jar with no top. You can always also use your coffee filter, and you can just take a coffee filter, put it over the top of your stuff, and then just put a rubber band around it, or we'll just use a rubber band. And say you can also do string, and there's other methods of tying this up, and then just leaving it to sit to use for later. So this type of medicine.
Oh,
yes?
Rosalyn, can I interrupt for 1 second? Someone had a question in the chat. Selena asked, what is the shelf life for jarred sage? And she said she recently found a jar that's probably 20 years old.
Oh, oh, so you mean how old
how long might it still be usable? Yeah.
You know what? That's a really good question. I'm just going to say, one, I'm not sure, but I know that, for example, my grandmother and my aunts kept this stuff forever. They would always, of course, try to get fresh, especially sage, because it's so ubiquitous. You can find it everywhere. They would try to replenish those supplies, but there's some medicines that they had for years and years and years, and they would just use them later. I think with some herbs, so for example, sage usually has that very pungent smell. And one of the things I would say is that probably the medicinal quality is still going to be there, but not the smell or the flavor is going to be there. So you can still always use it. Anything that's been dried, you can still always use years and years later. It's just that the medicinal quality might not be as high. So you can always just add a little bit more to those things. Thanks, guys. So yeah, normally you just sort of like let this, you're going to see right now it's floating at the top. It will eventually sink. And that's why you're going to let it sit overnight or even for several days. This type of stuff really then, once you make it, can last forever. So one of the things I'll say that is different between the way sort of native people make medicine, well, you can already see this is beginning to turn. You guys might not be able to see, but I can see it. It's already beginning to turn a very, very light kind of silvery green already, even though all we did was just put lukewarm water on it. So one of the things I'd say is different between the way native people do medicine and usually non-native like herbalists is oftentimes herbalists will strain things after they've been sitting for a certain number of hours. A lot of times native people don't strain it until they're going to actually drink it and use it. So for example, I get asked this question because people will read recipes on the internet, or they'll buy, a book at their local store about herbal medicines, and it will usually give instructions about, let this sit for 12 hours, then strain it off, and then use the medicine. So that's one method, but that's not the method that indigenous people usually did. They would actually just leave this until they used it. And then once they decided to use it is when they would then, I'm going to use this in here because I don't want to get it really dirty. And I would not normally do this. Pretend 12 hours has passed. Then you would just sort of, again, it's kind of like tea. You're going to pour this off. I'm going to pour this back in just a second. And take this, let it drain out. It's just a coffee filter. You can touch it, strain it like that. And then you have your medicine that then you can use. I'm actually going to dump that back in there, but again, this is something that you wouldn't actually strain anything off until after you decided to actually use the medicine. So that's one method that indigenous people use, is this sort of cold or kind of room temperature water method. And you can do this with a lot of different medicines. And so in fact, the stuff that I have sitting here, I'll just give you a few examples that I do have here. So this is white sage. You can use the cold brew method with white sage. This is just wild mint. You can do the same with wild mint. This is wild raspberry leaves, and you can do wild raspberry leaves also as a cold infusion. And what else do I have over here? Oh, and this is what's called Monarda or Bee Balm, and you can do the same with that. And there's a lot of different medicines that you can just do this cold brew method. And like I said, it was historically done with a lot of different stuff, and it's just easy to do, and you don't have to worry about boiling water. And the only difference is kind of on that level of medicinal quality, but also on the taste. So especially medicines that can have a very pungent flavor or kind of a spicy flavor, sometimes if you do cold brew the same way that you would do like cold brew coffee, which again takes that kind of high acidic level off of it, it's not going to have that same level of like pungency or like spiciness. So for some people who are sensitive to some of those tastes or just don't like them, cold brew method is a really easy way to do that without using hot water. Okay. So are there any comments or questions about that? So our next method that we're going to use is by boiling water and then pouring it over plants. So I always boil water with a kettle, which, you know, is a modern day method. You can also just boil water over the stove. So we're going to boil some water here in a sec. So I think I'm going to use this one. So in this particular case, I'm going to grab a couple of different berries that we have here that we're going to mix together. So this is elderberry, and elderberry is a great berry that you can use for boosting your immune system, and that's what a lot of people use it for. Of course, now you can buy this in the grocery store already ready-made, not as a tea or something like that. But one of the ways that indigenous people often made medicine, even though I just showed you one example where I used one herb, oftentimes people always mixed herbs together. So they would try to mix something that, for example, was both an immune booster, but then also had, you know, high vitamin content, or might have been, you know, had something else, an analgesic or an anti-inflammatory or something like that mixed together. So I'm just going to do kind of a couple of different berries. So this is, and this was about a teaspoon or so. So one of the things you can do if you're wondering about measurement is you can always just use your measuring spoons at home, like take a teaspoon, take a tablespoon, and then use that and then pour it in your hand, and then get an idea of what a teaspoon looks like in your hand or a tablespoon looks like in your hand of something. And you can just use like salt or sugar the first time just to test it out. So like take a teaspoon of salt, see what it looks like, tablespoon of salt, see what it looks like. That way you kind of have an idea. That way when you're just doing this sort of thing, you have a sense of like how much you're using. So I'm just adding some rose hips now. So when you use rose hips, you definitely have to use a strainer. Because there are seeds in rose hips that sometimes irritate people, especially if you're drinking this, can irritate people because the seeds have these little kind of hairy substances on them. Rose hips is a really nice berry or fruit of a plant which is the rose plant, which is really high in vitamin C, but also other vitamins and minerals. And people often add rose hips to a lot of different stuff to kind of boost both your immune system and adding that vitamin C content. The other thing I'm going to add to this, oh, maybe I'll add this. Wait, where I'm lost. Oh, here we go. Sorry. So the other thing I'm going to add to this is just some wild mint. So you can probably see, perhaps from the, I keep trying to use this so that you can kind of, you can still see in this, the wild mint has the leaves on it and the little purple flowers. And in this case, we're just going to kind of crush some of it, put it in here. And wild mint, of course, is used for a lot of medicinal qualities, but oftentimes people just add it to medicine because it tastes good. It adds a nice flavor to whatever you're making. So in this particular case, what we're going to do is just add hot water to this. So there's two different ways to do hot infusion of medicine.
Hey, Roz.
One is, yes.
Sorry, just a quick question. So you're using a lot of dried fruits. If we don't have these dried berries and fruits, can we use fresh ones? Like if we have fresh elderberry or frozen and like fresh mint, is that something we could use as well?
Yes, you can. And it's going to look different and taste different, just to let you know. So yes, you can. Pretty much in any of the cases of any of the stuff that I have on the table tonight, you can use fresh or you can use dried. I tried to pick examples tonight that are, let me just say this, are pretty benign. I tried to pick medicines today and tonight where people should not get sick from any of this if they try any of this at home. There are some medicines that you have to be really careful with, and you really do need a practitioner to help show you how to use them. These tonight you shouldn't have to worry about. But yes, so there is a difference between using fresh and using dried. So usually fresh, you're going to use half the amount, about approximately, than you would dry. So always think of that as kind of a 1 to 2 is kind of just a good idea of how you would add how you would add ingredients to making medicine. So if you are going to be using fresh mint or you are going to be using fresh berries, you want to use half that amount than when you use dried, because of it. Once it's dry, it has a stronger, there's a lot more that is in just a really small amount. Okay, so in hot infusion, we are not boiling this on the stove. It's sitting in a jar, and we're just going to add hot water to it. So we've already boiled our water, and then I just let it sit for a little bit. So I'm not pouring hot boiling water over this, but just kind of hot water. So this is our mixture of sort of 2 different berries and wild mint. And in this case, what you're going to do is you can just let it sit. Oftentimes when you do something like this, where you're just making a hot infusion, you do want it to sit for a while, so longer than tea. So people are kind of used to, when you make tea at home, you just sort of let it sit for, 3 minutes, 2-3 minutes, and then sometimes people take the tea bag out when you drink tea. When you're making medicine, you really want it to sit for 10 to 20 minutes or longer. So again, oftentimes the difference between the way indigenous people make medicine and non-indigenous people is non-indigenous people really will time it. They'll say, oh, I'm going to leave it for like 30 minutes, and then they strain it off, and then they keep the medicine separately. Indigenous people oftentimes, once they do this, they let it cool off. So this is really, really hot. Like I can barely touch it. It's really hot. They just let it cool off. Then they put the lid back on and they put it in their shelf, or they put it in their fridge. Today, they put it in their fridge. And then when they decide to use it, and again, I added I added rose hips to this, you definitely want to strain this off. And so especially when you're using something like rose hips, which again has some seeds in it that you don't want to actually ingest. Again, something like this, a coffee filter is always useful. I'm going to use the larger strainer right now and kind of just put this over a not so clean baking cup. And again, this is like way hot, and you can already see, I think you can see on the stream that even just me talking, and I think I only let it go for 2 or 3 minutes, not very long, that it already has got medicine in there. So I'm going to actually now kind of put that actually back in there. Sometimes what some people do now, and my grandmother wouldn't do this, but you could do this if you want to. Sometimes what people do now is they will actually put their medicine first in a tea bag, because you can buy those at the store as well, or a coffee filter, which is way cheaper. And then they would do the same thing, almost like they're making tea. So they'd already have it separated and sitting in the coffee filter, and then they would just let that sit. So again, the way my grandmother would do this is she would just let this sit and until the day she decided to use it. But she made medicine pretty much every day because she used it on a daily basis. And so usually something like this really would not be sitting in her fridge, I would say, for more than a week, because she'd probably use it or share it with somebody. So once this is made, you sort of set it to the side. It's still hot, and we'll let that kind of cool off. So that is one method. Okay, so how do you use these? I'll stop and talk about this for just a second. So there's a couple of different ways that you use herbal medicines. One way is to ingest it like a tea, which I've mentioned already several different times. The 2 things that we just made, you can drink those. Other medications you're going to use externally. And so you're going to be making medications where you're still going to be using these same methods, either kind of the cold brew, cold infusion method, or a hot infusion method. But then what you're going to do is use it externally. So there's a medicine that I'm going to share with us in a little bit, which is something that can be used internally and externally, but usually people are using it externally because it's an anti-inflammatory. So depending on the medicines that you have, different people use them different ways. So a modern method is just to take a paper towel and take your medication, take your paper towel, dip it in there, and then put it on whatever part of the body that you want to address. So for example, one of the medications or medicines that we have tonight, which I believe was shared with everybody who got one of the kits from All Nations, is Yarrow. So this is some Yarrow that is dried. I also have, let's see, where's another? Oops, I thought I had another. I have some more Yarrow, but this is some Yarrow that just came out of the garden here, and it's dried. Yarrow is used for a lot of different external wounds or bruising, or it's also used kind of like an antiseptic medicine. So if you've got some sort of anything from an insect bite to a bee sting to a cut or a wound, you can take that and you could use a cotton ball. You can use, like I said, paper towels. Back in the old days, my grandmother would always use like a cotton cloth or, like a bandana, and you can dip it in there and you would just put it on your wound or whatever it is. You can also, in this particular case, what I actually made with these 3 ingredients was something that you would drink. You could drink it as a tea, which means a really sort of mild amount of medication, or you can make this really strong, and it's more like almost like a syrup, but it's not a syrup, where you would have a stronger version of this that you would take on a daily basis for, in this particular case, the elderberry and the rosehip and the mint. You would be taking it to increase your and boost your immune system. When my grandmother was still with us, there were certain plants that she made these types of either hot or cold infusions, and she would make them very strong. And she would drink those every single day, usually at noontime and at dinner time. And so she would have in her refrigerator, sort of these large mason jars with she would always just call it her root medicine that she would add to her daily meals. And so this was, historically, Indigenous people always included medicine as part of their daily routine. So they either had it with their meal times, usually, and they would just add it as a drink. So today, we always drink coffee or, this is not coffee, this is just club soda with our meals. But historically, Indigenous people always had medicine with their meals as well. So they would eat their food and then they'd also have medicine. Today, we sometimes call that tea, right? But sometimes the teas that we drink today are not strong enough to be medicinal, but you can do that if you want to, again, for simple things like boosting your immune system. You can start making this type of stuff every single week and then drinking it every single day with one of your meals as part of just your regular daily routine.
Hey, Rosalyn, there's another question in the chat on when to pick yarrow. And if it went to seed, could you still pick it, or should you wait till the next spring? Or
so yarrow is one of those amazing plants that you can really pick any time, and you can use any part of it. So you can use the flowers, you can use the stems, you can use the leaves. It is very much like a weed. It grows anywhere. Here in Missoula, Montana, I think you can walk down any alley of Missoula and you're going to find yarrow in the alley. Yarrow is you can find pretty much anywhere. Similar to other plants, like I would say the same is true with sage. Some people are very particular about sage when they're using sage for religious purposes. Sometimes if you're using it for religious purposes, it does have to be in a certain part of its life cycle. But if you're using it for medicine, you can use it anytime. You can pick it anytime. You can pick it until it begins to go dormant. Certain plants, if you're using them for medicine, oftentimes they are medicinal throughout their entire growing cycle. It just depends sometimes how much medicine is going to be in a particular plant at a particular time in its growing cycle. Usually the same is true with things that are edible. They're edible throughout their entire growing cycle. They just don't taste as good when they get to their, sort of their peak form. So you can always eat, berries when they're green. They just don't taste so good. And you can always eat them after they're completely ripe. Again, usually don't taste so good. So usually you want to get them right when they're most ripe. But a lot of medicinal stuff, kind of any time in its growing cycle. But it depends. Let's say that depends. So no, that's a really good question. But yarrow is one of those ones. It's everywhere, and you can always pick it. Yeah. Okay, so I'm not sure if folks are going to be able to see this. Okay, maybe a little bit. I was going to say, let's just over here. So the next one I wanted to put this down. And hopefully we don't blow the electricity here.
How does that look?
I think it looks, yeah, it's fine. Okay. So this is, yes.
Sorry. Another question in the chat. This one's good. Does cold brewing valerian root cut the foot smell? Is there any way to cut that foot smell?
No. No, you can try to add other types of plants that have more flavor to them. So you can try and add the wild mint or even the elderberry or even service berries. You can add something that's going to add flavor to it, but no. And if you buy it in the store, so for example, right now, if you buy Celestial Seasonings tea, so not an advertisement for Celestial Seasonings, but they do have a tea that includes valerian as part of it, but they have added valerian and like chamomile and spearmint and wild mint. Like they are trying to disguise that valerian as much as possible with a lot of other flavors in there. Okay, so the next one I wanted to show folks is similar to kind of the hot brew, but you're actually boiling the medicine. And so in this particular case, I'm going to, and this is one where we might have to have our students bang this on the floor, but I'll do a fake version for you guys and they can do a real version. So I'm going to say maybe just do something small like that. And so I'll do the fake and then I'll give you guys the, okay, so here's what you normally do. I'll switch you guys out. Okay, so alum root, wait, maybe turn the camera just to me for a sec. Okay, sorry guys. Yes, I think we're good. Okay, so alum root is a root that you dig out of the ground. You have to clean it, you have to wash it, and then dry it. You can also use this fresh, but it's actually much better if you use it dry. This is a really great anti-inflammatory. The Blackfeet have used it probably for thousands of years for arthritis and for other types of injuries. And it really is kind of amazing. It also, for you modern day folks out there, you can also use it for things like puffy eyes, you know, so if you've got, you know, dark eye circles and puffy eyes, you can also use this as an anti-inflammatory as well. But usually people use it for things like arthritis. So usually what you do is as you can see, it is a root. It almost kind of looks like bear root for folks who know what bear root looks like. So it's going to be in really large pieces. I picked out a very small kind of narrow piece just for an example. But normally what you would do is you would break this. This is when you use your cloth. You would break this into tiny pieces. This is small enough for me to break. You would take your cloth like this, you'd have your roots in there, and then you take your hammer or your sledgehammer and you smash it into smaller pieces. You have to do that because sometimes these are just way too big and you don't want to actually throw them in whole. You actually do want to chop them up. So I'm going to let these guys do this. So here you can just kind of do it on the floor. So you're not going to be able to see this, folks, out there in Zoom land. Yeah, just do it on the floor. So just chop it up. And then this is a type of medicine that we actually do want to boil. So normally you put it in water on the stove and you are boiling it. And you are usually boiling this for a good 20 to 30 minutes in boiling water. Right now we've got simmering water here, and you guys are going to hear this. So yeah, back in the day, my grandmother had a small sledgehammer that she used. You can also use a rock if you want to, or like I said, a lot of times I just use a small jar like this to smash it, but it depends on how thick it is, because you can actually break your jar. Okay, I think it's good. It's good. We're going to be leaving a hole. I'm sorry, Payne Family Native American Center. So then after, thank you. So after you kind of put it in your cotton piece of cloth here, and then you smash it, then you just take it and dump it into, let's see, I'm going to see if people can see this. it's actually almost, these guys did a great job. It's almost like a powder form that they were able to get this particular bit of alum root. So you can dump it in here. One of the things you'll notice about alum root is when you do make medicine out of it is that it turns, oh, you can really smell this actually. If you guys can smell the actual cloth.
Is that showing the pot?
Yeah, that's showing the pot. Yeah. Okay, now you can pull back. Yeah, yeah. Great. Cool. Just so just to let people at home know, this is the very first time we've ever done this because we usually do these in person, and since all nations went to remote, we decided to do this remotely, and using the camera and the tripod and all this is our first time we're doing this. So in this particular case, for those of us who are here live, we can smell this. This is a particular plant that is really high in tannins, which is why it's used as an anti-inflammatory. So this particular plant we are going to use externally. And so what would normally happen, and we don't have time for this, is we usually boil it kind of just on a simmering mode, and it's simmering right now for 20-30 minutes. And then after it cools down, put it in a jar or put it in a container, and then you would use it again, usually with a piece of cloth, but today, with modern times, we use paper towels, or we use cotton balls or something like that. One of the things you can also do with this particular medicine in particular with alum root is you can boil it down until it really is concentrated. So you could let it simmer for even longer than like 30 minutes. You can let it simmer for an hour or so until it kind of, the half of the water or more evaporates and it's a concentrate. And once you have that, then once it's cool, you can mix it with oil. Why you would want to do that with this particular medicine is because it is so dry. It really dries out your skin. And so if you are using it, for example, as an anti-inflammatory for arthritis, so for example, your arthritis is in your hands, you would, get this soaking wet. You'd get it wet from the medicine. You'd put this on there and let it sit for a while, but then it's going to completely dry out your hand. So then you'd have to put something on your hand, lotion, oil, or something like that. So that's why sometimes people will actually make this into a concentrate and then mix it with olive oil. And then you still have to shake it. So think like salad dressing, because it's going to separate. But when you want to use it, shake it up and then use it as an external. Again, this one you can use internally as well. There are some medications though, and again, we're not sharing any of those today, but there are some medications that require that you have a practitioner show you how to use it, because you cannot ingest them. You can only use them externally. And so those types of medicines you just have to be careful with. Sometimes medicines can be toxic. And so you want to be really careful when you're using them. So normally what I haven't done, and I'll share with you what you should be doing, is normally when you are making medicine, you should sort of do kind of one thing at a time. Go wash your hands and then make the next bit. So that's just to be careful that you don't accidentally either kind of, if you are using something that is toxic, that you're not mixing that with another medicine and you're not getting it too much on your hands. So when you use something, go wash your hands with soap, come back out. And then I'll just say one thing, and I meant to bring some of this with me, but I didn't, is again, think natural. So try to use natural soaps that are not going to flavor or perfume the medicines that you're making. So make sure you're using sort of that, something that doesn't have any kind of flavor to it. So this is going to keep going probably until after we are done with our session, but I'm going to actually take it off right now. We're going to pretend like it's done, but it's not done. So we would normally turn that off. And again, Grandma would not separate this, but I'm going to do it. So using one of our, I guess I'll use the bigger sieve, using one of our sieves and putting a coffee filter in there. Take your medicine and you're going to pour this off. So what my grandmother would normally do is a lot of times she wouldn't even put it in a jar. She would just leave it in the pot. And she would just put the pot in her refrigerator. And one of the reasons why she would do that is because this particular medicine, alum root, you can use it over and over again until it stops being, until it stops having any color. So usually that means about 3 different times. So this is pouring through here. One of the things you should be able to see is it has kind of a reddish, tannish color. And that is the medicine that is part of this. And so with this particular root, you can use it about 3 times. Usually about the 3rd time, it's not going to have this dark color anymore. It's going to be very light. And then that's when you know it's time to get some more medicine and boil it all over again. So oftentimes she kept it in her pot because she knew she was going to boil it again and boil it again and boil it again. But you can move it to another. This is slowly going through. Okay, what is our time? Our time's good. Okay, so I'm just going to let that drip there for a sec. So the last method I'm going to show you is using oil. And I'm going to share with you a couple of ones that are already made. Move this off to the side. So as I mentioned earlier, when you are going to do oil infusion, you want to make sure everything is really clean and really dry. And depending on the plant that you're using and whether you're using fresh herbs or whether you're using dried herbs, there's going to be sometimes a different chemical reaction that happens with your, let me see if I can move this off to the side here. Okay, staying there. So I want to share with you a couple of ones that are already made. So these are very dark. It's a let's see. You can kind of see this. Yeah. Okay, so in person right now, it's getting dark here. I just realized. In person, these are really almost like a dark brown, a little bit of a red tinge in it. And both of these are made from the buds of a cottonwood tree. And this is a really common medicine, not just with indigenous people, but kind of people, I would say kind of, worldwide make this particular medication. But this is a great kind of the old-fashioned method of making Vicks Vapor Rub, right? It smells really amazing. It has this kind of really sweet kind of smell to it. But this particular oil infusion, you have to pick the cottonwood buds early in the springtime when they're just the leaves are just beginning to bud out. They're going to have a resin on them that is kind of almost bright orange and red. And when you're picking them, it's just unbelievably sticky. Your hands are going to turn completely kind of an orangish red. And you pick them, you cut them off of the ends of the cottonwood branches, and then you infuse them in oil. And usually what you do is you collect enough of them that you're going to put maybe about 1 inch of oil more over on top of them, and you let it sit. Okay, as I mentioned before, there's 2 different ways of doing this, whether you're sort of indigenous or non-indigenous. So indigenous people usually just let it sit forever until they use it. Non-indigenous people will often let this sit for a couple of months, anywhere from a month to 3 months, and then they pour it off. They drain the actual cottonwood buds out of this. And then sometimes they will not just use the oil, but they'll mix the oil with, for example, beeswax and make a salve. But historically, the Blackfeet would just usually just leave it as an oil, and they would just use it as they went along. And you can kind of see that there's still cottonwood buds at the bottom of this. Sometimes what they would do is, as they're getting less, they would just add a little bit more oil to the mixture. It will have less medicinal qualities, but it kind of stretches the use of this particular plant. So what we're going to do tonight, though, is do, where's our, oh, here it is. We're going to make an infusion with our yarrow. So normally what you would do with yarrow, again, is you would have sort of your, and yarrow is, I would just say kind of the same, only different as cottonwood, in that it does provide that same sort of antiseptic quality, and you're going to be using it for usually for injuries, again, for like any kinds of insect bites or kind of external bruising or stuff like that. Once it has infused and the medicine is in the olive oil that we're going to be using today. Whereas the cottonwood buds are used primarily for like muscle aches, muscle pains. It really is kind of like, again, kind of a Vicks vapor rub or like a Bengay of today. So similar to what we did with our other plants, one of the easy ways to add this to this is just to use scissors. Scissors are easy. You can also just kind of rub these together too. I just like using scissors because then I can watch how much I'm adding, and I like to use all parts of this. So this, I don't think had any flowers on it. It was just the leaves and the stems. Some people will rub this so that they get just the leaves, or they just use the flowers. But we're just kind of going to use all of this. And then I'm not adding that much, so just as a demonstration. So this is probably about 2 tablespoons, not that much. And normally when you do an oil infusion, you're going to add, oops, see if I can undo this. Oh, there we go. So unlike water, so if we were adding water to this, we'd probably fill it to the top. But when you're adding oil, you don't fill it to the top. You're only going to add a little bit more than what is in here. I'm going to use a fork to... And then this is going to expand. So one of the things that some people do is they add just enough oil to sort of cover this, and you can kind of see how you can see the oil at the bottom is separating from the stuff at the top. A lot of times at this point, you don't add the lid yet. You're going to wait a few days for this. Oftentimes what people do is they'll take this, back in the day, grandma would cover this with a piece of cloth and a string. You can also use a coffee filter and a string, and you got to let it sit because it's going to breathe. You need to let this breathe for a little bit before you actually cover it with this. If you were to cover it with a lid, which sometimes people do, it will sometimes cause condensation because it's sort of breathing. If you do that, you got to take the lid off, wipe it down because it's going to be kind of a little bit wet, wipe down the inside, and then close it back up again. But it's easier just to sort of cover it with a coffee filter or a piece of cloth, and then you just let this sit. It kind of looks like salad dressing right now. But after, in this particular case, I would wait with this at least a month, but you can use it probably within a week's time as well. Let it sit for a little bit before you start using it. In this particular case, one of the things you're going to want to do, because I did chop it up in tiny pieces, is you are going to want to use a sieve and and take some of this off, or you don't have to. You can still just use this the way it is. Back in the old days, people always just used oil with the medicine on it already, and they would, if they were using it to rub on, again, sort of a bruise or a cut or something like that, they would want some of the yarrow included with the oil on their wound, and they would cover that. So those are kind of the three. Let me see if I can pull these out here. There's that example. That's the oil example. This is our boiling water example. This was just made with hot water, but not boiling water, and poured over our herbs. And this is kind of the cold brew method already. And you can see already with the cold brew method, it's already turning a light green. So I think I'm going to end. Oh, you can, yeah, that's perfect. You can just leave it on there. I think you could take that top bit of the camera and turn it down.
I can definitely point down.
But I mean, just the actual camera itself, like that. Yep, and you get that turns. There you go. Perfect. Yeah, that works.
Is that where you
Yep.
want it?
Yeah. But you can turn maybe just a little bit back. Just a little bit back. Okay. So at this point, if there's any questions, comments, just please let me know.
I just want to say thank you so much, Rosalyn, on behalf of All Nations Health Center. I have just enjoyed this series so much, and I hope we are able to do it again at some point. And before people get off, I mean, please ask questions at this point, but I do want to say I'm going to put a survey in the chat that we would love to have folks fill out and give us some feedback and ideas for future sessions and ways we could improve. So I'm going to put that in the chat. But yeah, please ask questions, folks, while we've still got Rosalyn on.
And I guess I'll just add one more thing here. And I've already said it before, but I'll say it again. You know, you can get all of the supplies to do this sort of thing at a thrift store, at a rummage sale. You do not need to go to the store and buy any of this stuff. You can find sieves at a thrift store. You can find any of these glass mason jars or measuring jars at a thrift store. Again, usually the only things you might have to buy new might be the lids, but you still even don't need to use lids if you want to use some other covering, whether it is coffee filters or something else. And then usually the only thing that's going to cost you a little bit of money is something like coffee filters, and they are not that expensive. The one thing that might be expensive is going to be olive oil. What I would say about this is that really olive oil is one of the better oils to use when you're doing oil infusion. And one of the reasons for that is because it does actually work really well with herbs. And it really combines nicely with herbs, which is why people use it in salad dressing. But it is also something that you know that you can always use as an edible. So you can always drink. Just FYI, when my grandmother was still with us, she actually drank some of her medicinal medicine, or she just drank olive oil as a medicine itself. So she would drink a couple of tablespoons of either olive oil or olive oil mixed with other stuff. So what's nice about olive oil is you can do that if you want to. So if you are making some sort of medicine, especially a medicine that might be something like that is good for your immune system, and you're mixing it with olive oil, you can always drink olive oil as a medicine itself with that stuff infused in it. And so that might be the only thing that might be costly versus using other types of oil. Some people also sometimes use almond oil, almond oil that has no perfume in it. So perfumed almond. What did I just say? Did I say olive? Almond oil. You can also use, but that is also can be very costly. So I don't use almond oil very often. So.
Could we maybe turn the camera back to Rosalyn's face?
Oh, yeah.
While she's talking, but there's a couple more questions in the chat, Rosalyn, in regards to oil and lard. So, what was the first question is what was the traditional substitute for olive oil, or what was traditionally used rather than olive oil? And then another question is do you make any medicines with lard, and are there any medicines that you'd recommend making with lard or using lard with?
So historically, people usually used bison fat or other types of animal fat. And there was some also animals where they would collect the oil of the animal and mix it with medicine as well. But bison fat was usually what they used, or bison marrow, and those can be boiled. And when they are boiled, it turns into an oil, and then when it goes back to room temperature, it solidifies. I don't know if I mean I think that folks sometimes use lard as a an agent to include add medicines to, but I have not ever used lard, and I know that my family did not use lard as a to use with medicine. So are there any other comments or questions? So I guess I'll just add one final thing, and then I think we can wrap up. As I mentioned earlier, and as I've mentioned in other presentations that is part of this series, sometimes especially when you're making medicines, the medicines do not taste so good. So oftentimes people would always mix other things in to make it taste a little bit better. So something like wild mint is always a nice thing to add to some of these. Also, different types of berries have really nice flavors that you can add to your medicine. It's not going to change the medicine in any way in terms of what the medicinal quality is. It's just going to add something more to it. So having wild mint on hand is always helpful to be able to throw into any of these types of medicines that you create so that you can use them, especially if you're going to ingest them and you want them to taste just a little bit better. So, well, I'll just end by saying thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you so much for joining us for this entire series that we had this last few months with All Nations and with Here Montana. And we'll look forward to the next workshops that All Nations organizes and puts together. And for those of you who came live in the past, thank you so much for coming here to the Payne Family Native American Center and to the Ethnobotany Garden outside here at the University of Montana. And of course, you're always welcome to come here, and you're always welcome to walk around the garden and learn about all of the plants that we have in the garden here. And you can also check out our website at the University of Montana, the Ethnobotany Garden. We have a website that talks about all of the different plants that we have here in our garden, which we have over 100 different species here of plants that are used and that are used for all the different tribes here in the state of Montana. So thank you, everybody, for coming. It was a great time that we've had these last few months.
Thank you so much, Roz. This has been wonderful. And please, if you can, fill out the survey, folks. We appreciate the feedback. I'll be emailing it to everyone who had previously attended events. And we will give away some, we've got 3 books to give away to some lucky winners of folks who fill out the survey. So we've got a couple of books that Rosalyn recommended, the Edible Wild Plants of the Prairie and Medicinal Wild Plants of the Prairie, as well as Braiding Sweetgrass. So 3 lucky winners will get some cool books. So anyway, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Rosalyn, for sharing this time with us. This has been wonderful.
Sure. Well, I'm going to have my 2 students come around and say hello just really quickly, a quick wave, who have been helping me with this kind of this big mess that we've just made. So you have to kind of bend down a little bit.
Down?
Yes, yeah. So.
Hi.
So these are the folks behind the camera and kind of in front of the camera with helping with all of this stuff. So again, thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.